Hi, and welcome to the Control Engineering and Industrial Cybersecurity Pulse webcast, Fearlessly Implement Cybersecurity at the Edge, sponsored by Stratus. I'm your moderator, Gary Cohen. Happy to join you today. Here are some tips and tricks to help you get the most from today's webcast. If you are experiencing issues with your slides or audio, simply refresh your browser or click the Refresh Media button directly under the presenter's picture. You can control the volume of this webcast by adjusting the volume on your computer or by adjusting the volume on the webcast platform. If you're having technical problems with audio or the slide presentation, just click on the question mark in the top right corner of your screen to access a list of system checks to try before contacting an online technician. But if you do need a technician, type a message into the Ask a Question box and someone will get to you as quickly as possible. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Stratus Technologies for sponsoring today's event. Stratus is a global leader in simplified, protected, and autonomous edge computing platforms. All right, let's get to it. I am happy to introduce today's presenters. We'll start with Barry Delasise. He's a Senior Director of Product Management at Stratus. Barry has held various roles in both product marketing and technical engineering over the past 20 years. Prior to joining Stratus, he worked at RSA, the security division of EMC, where he was responsible for product strategy, management, and user experience. We also have Dino Busalaki, who is the CTO and co-founder of Velta Technology. Dino has close to 4 decades of global experience across information technology, engineering, and industrial control systems with multiple globally recognized brands, including Rockwell Automation, Anheuser-Busch, American Standard, and General Motors. Jim Cook is COO for Velta Technology. Jim has spent his career in executive roles within IT organizations for Jockey International, Rawlings Sporting Goods, Arthur Andersen, KPMG, and Heartland Dental. Frank Cohen, last but definitely not least, is the general manager of the Americas for Clarity. Frank is an accomplished global sales leader with experience selling enterprise software, hardware, professional services, and other technology solutions to Fortune 1000 companies. He's held executive roles at Remediant, OpSWAT, Hewlett-Packard, AT&T, and others. During today's session, our panel will help to demystify emerging security concepts so you can fearlessly implement cybersecurity at the edge with a focus on the current state and challenges of edge OT security, tips to prevent and predict risk, how to get started and key takeaways, and we'll, of course, save some time at the end for a Q&A. So before we jump into what should be a robust discussion, let's take a second to define edge computing and kind of level set us all for today's discussion. To start, the edge, in its simplest terms, is the physical location within your business where data is collected, analyzed, and needed most. Now, this, of course, varies based on the type of business, a production line in a manufacturing facility, for example. Edge computing is a distributed computing model in which computing takes place near or at the edge, often in collaboration with a centralized server or the cloud. This model enables the growing number of sensors, devices, and software platforms being deployed at the edge to securely organize, process, and interpret data in real time on site. Edge computing creates new and improved ways for leaders to maximize operational efficiency, improve performance and safety, ensure the availability of business-critical operations, and even automate processes. So with that definition in context, let's move on to our first topic of discussion. So we're going to start off today talking about some of the key challenges of the edge, specifically around OT security. Frank, so let's start off with you. What are the threats as you see them?
Yeah, no, thank you, Gary. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Look, there's good news and bad news here. It's sort of a live by the sword, die by the sword story. We've got all of this innovation and incredible technology that's enhancing productivity and making all of our organizations more productive, more revenue, more efficient, et cetera. However, those technologies, when connected, also increase the attack surface that can be exploited. And when that happens, you can have a bad outcome. So some of the things we see, obviously loss of revenue, loss of productivity, potentially supply chain issues, could have effects to brand reputation, fines, all the bad stuff we all read about and hear about. What makes this space particularly concerning is that it can also have environmental implications. It could have implications to the environment. It could have implications to our society as we know it. It could have implications to human life. So imagine a rogue nation state affecting our food supply or our water that we drink or medications that we use. These could have real life implications on society, employees, people, just as we know it today. So it's a big deal.
Absolutely. Dino and Jim, let's go to you on this. So how are you seeing this affect key customers, manufacturing, VARs, utilities, oil and gas, et cetera?
Well, it's impacted them pretty significantly, right? To the point where with Industry 4.0 initiatives or digital transformation, and as Frank was stating, the connectivity has moved all the way down into the industrial environment. And what we haven't really taken into account is the weaknesses of lack of security around industrial control system assets, right? My background, like as you mentioned, 4 decades of building out the infrastructure around that environment. One of the key tenets is visibility when you think about the security frameworks that are out there. So if you're looking at NIST, MITRE ATT&CK, the IEC 60443, any of those standards, the number one tenet is visibility, right? And right now in the industrial world, we never had these tools, right? And Clarity has brought that visibility capability down into that environment. The challenge has just been the awareness factor, right? It's the IT/OT convergence model. We hear that conversation a lot. In my view, at the end of the day, OT needs to own this because those assets are theirs. They understand process. And it's not just cybersecurity, it's also process integrity. Again, Frank touched on that. How are you dealing with your unplanned, unscheduled downtime? And then internal threats are just as devastating as external threats. So, if you want to get safer sooner, you're going to have to start looking at some visibility methodologies to bring into that industrial space. And, the Stratus platform, I came across them working for Rockwell several years ago. And that platform, fell into a really good sweet spot because of the hardening nature to get it in the industrial environment, to use these technologies, to get them further down. And I know later on we're going to have a discussion on an architecture to see how and where these industrial assets fit in order to gain visibility into that industrial environment.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add to that, Dino mentioned about the ownership, and it's the IT/OT convergence. And my background is from the IT side. Dino here has converted me to the OT side, and that's you really have to play against and understand that space, that the IT is approaching it differently than the OT, but there's similar problems, but it doesn't work. And what I like to say is that IT enterprise cybersecurity approaches don't always work in IT. You ask the IT, what's the top IT cybersecurity answer, right? It's like real estate, right? What are the top 3 things in real estate? Location, location, location. Well, the top IT answers for cybersecurity is patch, patch, patch. Well, that's not what you can do in the OT world. And, add to the fact other things like antivirus and endpoint protection, those things don't exist. And that's a real hard concept always to really, from the IT side to go, well, no, let's just patch it. Let's just scan the network. Let's put the antivirus on. And that's a challenge out there. And that gets to what Dino mentioned, is about that ownership. Who really ultimately owns it? And customers are struggling with that. And IT can't help if they're not working with OT. So if a company's looking and saying, well, that's IT's responsibility, you've got to work together. It's not one or the other here. They're connected. They're part of the same business. And it's not just about those digital outcomes anymore. When you get to IT, IT cybersecurity is focused on those digital outcomes from digital systems. From the OT side, those are digital systems controlling physical outcomes. It's a little bit different, but ultimately all the cyber risk needs to be rolled up as a business risk, and that's how it needs to be managed. And these groups need to get together, and that's what a lot of customers are struggling with as they try and find the approach and find an answer.
Yeah, it's really about those two sides kind of understanding each other and embracing the differences. And I think on that note, Barry, can you talk a little bit about what makes security at the edge different?
Yeah, So thank you again, and to my fellow presenters here. I think as mentioned earlier, by Frank and Dino, I think inherently there's the OT is a target of a lot of these attacks, just because of the criticality of the processes and the infrastructure that's running in these environments. And when you think about the OT environments, they traditionally have not been built with security in mind. Both from the infrastructure perspective, from the applications, from the different devices, even from the skill set side in terms of the people's background and knowledges. If you think about having these high threats, having this sort of criticality of having uptime be important, especially in these critical applications, customers are really struggling with, how do they make sense of that? How do they prepare and plan appropriately to manage those threats and risks, but also deal with the challenges they have, in the skill sets and having security not built in. And so I think it's really creating this new paradigm that people are looking for solutions that are more turnkey, that are really able to help kind of bridge that skill set divide and bring some of those IT best practices, IT capabilities into the edge. And I think because it hasn't always been there as a top of mind, either as a priority or as sort of a built-in capability, it's something that sometimes people don't think about, and therefore they're kind of struggling and they're playing a bit more reactive than proactive. I think the edge, just because of the nature of what it is in these industrial environments and criticality, it's hard. You're trying to keep pace with competition, these growing challenges, but you got to take the time to understand what's happening and how best to prepare for the future and have that kind of long-term solution in mind.
Sure. Yeah, definitely it takes a little bit of planning. So let's move on to our next topic of discussion here, which is how can companies predict and prevent OT cybersecurity risks? Frank, we'll start with you. What's available right now to counter all the cyber threats and challenges that are out there?
Well, I think this is where I shamelessly promote my my technology. Just kidding. No, we've got some fantastic technologies here with Clarity and Stratus and Velta all working together to deliver a host of solutions that can help. But the reality is there's no silver bullet. There's no easy button. The best approach in security in general is a layered approach. It looks at leveraging best of breed technologies, and it also looks at leveraging best practices. So the company with the best technologies and the best practices, well thought out, usually wins and mitigates exposure to their environment. It's also about having a plan. It's about having a plan for remediation. What happens when you get breached? How do you back up, restore your environment? It's understanding your posture, where your inventory and assets are, and what do you do in the event that you wake up and have a bad day? It's also about training and knowledge and making sure that you have all hands and resources on deck when needed, so that everybody understands their roles and their responsibilities. So, in short, sadly, there's no easy button. There's no silver bullet. It is a combination of technology and process, people, and when they all come together, you can mitigate or limit your exposure.
Dino and Jim, let's go to you for a practical discussion here. What should an organization's OT architecture look like?
Well, there's kind of two parts to it. One is organizationally, right? One of the biggest challenges is what kind of new organization will you most likely form to be able to deal with this environment, right? And that's one of the biggest challenges. And one of the other things I wanted to touch on real quickly is, because of the pandemic that we came out of and are still in, we've kind of kicked the doors open with remote access into this environment, and given access to a lot of different organizations, whether it be your OEMs, your system integrators, your third-party support groups, even your own internal staff, and in blowing holes in these firewalls that are out there to get to these various different industrial protocols that clients have. I mean, no organization has a single autonomous automation technology vendor in their plant. There's usually several, right? And so that's a lot of different applications, a lot of different protocols, a lot of different access into that space. So organization one is you really got to rethink of your organization and who's going to own and run with these OT security platforms. That's one. Architecturally, if you're familiar with the ISA 95 model or the Purdue model, and you start looking at what is at the IDMZ layer at 3.5. It's from that space down, right? And that's where you really get into what OT and IT have a little bit of commingling, which has happened a lot. And again, back to digital transformation industry 4.0 and on this connectivity, we see that quite a lot where these IT and OT assets are commingled in that environment. But then you get down into the PLC level, into the lower levels, 2, 1, and 0, where the PLC is acting as a network segmentation device or multiple network cards in your historians or engineering workstation, what have you, are providing that visibility down through that environment. And the question really begins is, how do you start structuring that, right? And get it and look at segmentation between IT and OT again, physically connected, logically separated. How do you manage that logical separation? How do you keep an eye on it, right? If IT puts in a firewall, should OT put in their firewall? Zero trust, right? Why should I trust them if they don't trust me, right? Why are they putting in a firewall? Who are they protecting themselves from? Me on the OT side. So if I'm an OT guy, well, I want my own firewall to protect myself from IT. So when you start tearing into that organization from an organizational perspective and from an architectural perspective, what makes the most sense for the business? And what I will say is there's a human capital challenge on the OT side from a cybersecurity perspective, right? So how do we get IT people to understand process integrity, operational resiliency? Those are all relevant to the OT space, right? I've heard OT people say cybersecurity just gets in the way of getting things done. So the question then becomes, well, then who's responsible for it? If I pull open a panel and there's variable speed drives and there's PLCs and there's industrial switches in there and HMIs, who's responsible for the cybersecurity of that stuff, right? OT can't say it's IT because they don't own that. They don't even know what that stuff is. They're not even managing or maintaining it. They don't have any visibility to it. OT, you own it. It's yours. Now, how are you going to secure it? You can ask IT for help, best practices, technologies, policies, to help you, but they can't drive the bus. So when you look at it from an architectural standpoint, and you start looking through your organization on how you're going to control and manage those assets, that's going to help you form your organization and then bring in partners who work in this space. Going out and finding an IT VAR is not necessarily going to be the best source of information to help you protect your control system environment.
I just want to jump in, and anybody listening to Dino and hearing the IT OT thing, I come from the IT side. Dino comes from the OT. So you can expect that internally we have some lively discussions every once in a while. So I always tell the story. I've been in charge of major applications and major IT investments, and it was years before I actually went down on the floor and opened up one of those enclosures, and they opened it up, showed me what was in it, and I said, "Close that thing. I don't want to see it." So there really is that. We spent years building, these practices of separating, and now we've got to bring everybody back together, and it doesn't mean that we're commingling, but it does mean that we have to live together. And so how is it going to be ultimately architected inside of a particular environment? That may be a little bit different depending on which environment it is. One of the big things, as Dino noted, was this segmentation. And I do want to know, when you get into architecture, this is actually a question now that we've seen popping up on cybersecurity insurance questionnaires. So if you're not properly segmented, you might not be getting cyber insurance here in the near future. So that's something to think about. And even going down to the proper segmentation, even further down into micro-segmentation for continuous improvement of your security posture, that's a possibility too. I mean, one of the things that we found is with clients is every one of them, once they gained true visibility of what they had, there were surprises. I mean, we've got a number of people that we work with that say air gapped, and well, yeah, they think they're air gapped, but if you're not taking the right steps to really ultimately understand what you have, that's going to be an issue to decide where you're going to go. And then even once you decide where you're going to go, you need to think about that active program. How are you going to manage it? That's a lot of change that's getting put into place. And again, something that Dino mentioned, that resource capability. This is a space that you can't just call up your local IT guy and say, hey, I need an OT cybersecurity analyst, a network analyst to figure out whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. And then keep that, you got to think of it, OT guys love continuous improvement. I think it's a great thing too. Continuous improvement, risk reduction. We're living in fairly dynamic times. It's not a static world when it comes to this space. I mean, you've got constant operational changes. There's Industry 4.0, the COVID remote, and then constantly new threats, new discovered vulnerabilities. And all this has to coexist in this environment with legacy equipment. And so that OT architecture then becomes just as important as your cybersecurity positioning.
Makes sense. Barry, so what is the role of edge computing platforms to address these threats?
Yeah, well, I think first, I mean, as Frank talked about initially, I think, you gotta understand identify your assets and what their role is. And when we think about edge computing, its primary role is to ensure the continuous operation of whatever process is running on the plant floor or across the pipeline or whatever it may be. How does edge computing do that? It provides a low latency, highly reliable, secure platform to protect those applications and workloads. When we go out and talk to customers, what we hear all the time from them is that, to them, one of their biggest challenges and the threats is when they add new devices to the network. It's certainly you're going through refreshes, you're trying to go after these digital transformation initiatives. And how do you know that the new device you're putting on your network is not going to worsen your security posture or create new vulnerabilities and threats, to your environment? So, if you have this device that's trying to make sure those applications are running, you want something that's going to give you all that capability. You really need to look at something that is designed with security in mind. So you should be looking at what is the capabilities of the solutions. Was it designed with the standard in mind? Does it provide some of that segmentation that Dino provided, right? Can you segment via networking and virtual networking? You segment the OT and the IT network so that your HMI and SCADA can communicate and you can get the information flowing that way, but then you can still get your data back to a historian, in the enterprise, the level 4, level 5 within their Purdue model. Does it have capabilities that protect the data at rest and data in motion? That's flowing through these devices, right? These are some of the questions that you want to make sure. So really, understanding, knowing what that role is, identifying that role, and then ensuring that you're selecting something that's going to not make your security worse, but ultimately fit into what your strategy is, and give you some of the assurances. I think is critical when selecting in edge computing. You're not taking a commodity piece anymore of hardware and just throwing it at the edge. You're going to really find something that's intelligent and advanced and gives you some of those advanced capabilities to help protect the data and the assets and your people.
Mm-hmm. Going back to something, Jim, that you said a second ago on IT-OT convergence, you said when you were working in IT, you went down to the plant floor, you opened up the enclosure. I assume that's not unusual that IT professionals have not adventured down to the plant floor to see what's in those boxes.
No, it is not unusual. The OT guys aren't necessarily all that welcoming to let the IT guys go in. It's just it's a different mentality. When you're dealing with digital outcomes to physical outcomes, and you see the IT guys and they keep them on the carpet, right? Don't come out here. Don't come out here on the concrete. Fortunately, I was in a position that they had to let me out there. They opened up the door and I was smart enough to walk away at the time because I didn't understand that stuff. But you think of, that IT reaction to go, well, have you restarted it? Well, no, you can't restart it because that's going to shut down the line, and that line shuts down, and then we're not producing. So some of the first reactions from the IT perspective just they don't make sense when you're on that operational floor and that physical outcome. And so we've spent, and like I said, we spent decades here, the past decades, saying, stay away. You stay on your side, we'll stay on our side. You stay on the carpet, we'll stay out here on the concrete. Because what you do on that digital side doesn't always make sense, and there's bigger implications if you do that on that operational side, on that production side, right?
Right. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So let's go ahead and move on to our third and final topic here of the day. Now that we've heard about some of the key challenges and kind of how to predict and prevent OT cybersecurity risk, what are some of the best practices to get started in integrating edge into a security strategy? Dino and Jim, I'm going to start with you guys this time. Again, let's talk practically. So what can we do right now to get started?
Well, one is OT needs to start thinking about their own budget for cybersecurity, right? They need to take a look at what kind of a budget do you have regarding your control systems, right? And even if that means sitting down with IT and showing that to them. There's a really great video that I caught that Clarity did with Pfizer not too long ago, and it stemmed from the WannaCry event that happened a few years ago. And what happened is the VP of engineering called the CISO up at Pfizer, basically said, hey, look, you and I have a problem that we need to solve together. We need to figure this out. And the CISO, he actually left him a voicemail. And he picked up the phone and called the VP of engineering back a few days and said, hey, I'm really interested in what you're talking about. I need to see it. So he came down, going back to Jim's conversation about getting out on the plant floor, taking a walk around, opening up those panels. And the CISO's response was, I had no idea that this is the stuff that requires security that we're not even involved in, right? And so you have to begin that conversation. If you're an IT professional, you should be shadowing your process control engineers. If you have responsibility for any support at the plant at all, even if it's at the infrastructure level, the network, the office applications, whatever the case may be, somehow there needs to be a relationship between IT and OT to really start formulating that relationship and working together to understand the problems that they need to try to solve, number one. Number two is you need to start looking at the landscape of your partner community in this space, right? Stratus. If you're a Rockwell shop, you should be talking to Rockwell. You have system integrators out there that are starting getting into this business, the channel, to start finding out from them what's going on. What are your peers doing? What are your colleagues and competitors possibly doing to help secure and protect this environment today? So there has to be an opening for IT and OT to work together. I would say that OT has to own it, because at the end of the day, unless IT is going to be responsible for production and be responsible for those physical outcomes that happen on that plant floor, then that's a new day. It's not a day that I've seen, and I've been doing this for quite a while. Most of our successes come from working purely with OT groups who are still interested in owning and managing their space, but that doesn't mean that IT doesn't play a role. So again, I'd go back to budget. I would try to get the C-suite involved, just like the VP of engineering from Pfizer and the CISO having to sit down and have this conversation and show it to them. Because to Jim's point earlier, they don't know what they don't know. And somebody's got to put it in front of them. And it's out there. And, there's a tremendous amount of more OT, IoT assets out there on their plant floor. You're looking at a 20-to-1 ratio, probably bigger depending on the type of organization you are, of the number of assets connected that OT owns compared to IT, with very few people managing that space, right? Most of those OT folks, they have 5, 6, 7, 8 jobs, right? And this is a full-time job, right? Whoever ends up owning this OT platform and this security, it's a full-time job for a handful of people, depending on, again, the number of plants in your fleet and the number of devices that you have and the size and scope of that organization. It's a net add activity, right? And the sellers need to understand that are selling this information, selling these platforms to these organizations to prepare them for that. Because what comes out of this environment is a mountain of information. And you got to start making sense of it and organizing it and getting it into the hands of the right people on the plant floor to deal with their particular process area, cell, zone, line, and start breaking it down, and start removing the noise. If there's a lot of IT traffic and IT activity down there, pulling it back and getting it away from this environment, because it just creates more confusion in the space.
Yeah, I'd like to, touch on what I call the 3 legs, right? You got to get started. There's 3 legs to this, and we mentioned IT and OT. The third leg that I like to look at is it's a 3-legged stool. You're going to need that third one. Where's that ownership? Who owns that risk? The business risk here, right? And it may be, your operations guy, but usually you've got some sort of risk management team. A lot of times in the mid-market, it's the CFO. It could be the CEO, right? And if you look at it as a business risk standpoint and start asking these questions to say, well, who owns it? What kind of risk do we have? How much would it cost if this facility just shuts down, right? And sometimes business leadership is so focused on value creation, right? They're focused on value creation. What are we doing to create more business? How can we get more efficient? How can we be more profitable? They have to remember at times value protection is just as important, right? Value protection, and that gets into, I mean, they're doing it with risk management, and you can't just step aside and say, well, that's cybersecurity stuff, that OT cybersecurity, that's too technical. There's some people working on it. It's a business risk. Roll that thing in. And one of the ways to do that is look and see if you're doing some kind of regular penetration tests, audits, risk review. It may already be in place, and it's likely that that's already happening on the IT side. It's been happening for years on the IT side, and they're probably falling under some sort of data compliance issues or doing PCI or whatever that might be. So there's some sort of review going on where they're on a regular basis looking at these things. But are they doing it for the OT, and why not for the OT? And to say, hey, let's do those same things, because we've had some great success with our partners here, with the Clarity and the Stratus guys, for what we would consider a low risk approach. I mean, inside of 30 days to go in there and say, look, it's low risk. You don't have to go out and worry about, $500,000 or finding somebody. Look, let's just go in there now. Let's take a quick look and see what kind of risk you have. We believe that monitoring and putting it in place, and this is important, but it's really hard to create a case for for that risk manager until you get those details, until you get some of that visibility that Barry was talking about, and until you really understand those risks and go, holy cow, it's real, and here's the detail. So now I've got a case that can help me move it forward. But doing nothing is not going to get you anywhere. So you need to get started.
That makes sense. And Dino, you and I have talked before about, Jim, you just talked about value protection versus value creation. If that production line stops running, everybody has problems.
Yeah, those are the cash registers, right? The plant floor is how you make your money. Remember, OT is all about revenue. IT's expense, their overhead, right? And OT, only thing they want to do is they want to get back up and running just as fast as they can. In most cases, they don't even care about incident response, especially if it was a ghost in the machine kind of activity that shut them down. They're not even really sure what it was. They just know things quit working. And by the time they cleaned up the mess and reset everything and got QA to approve it, they just want to get back up and running, right? And there's no incident response. It could have been an internal behavior, right? Something that we've witnessed. We watched a steel plant go through 30 hours of shutdown just because IT decided to run a scan of their network at the wrong time during the startup, and it wiped out all the IP addresses in their PLCs, right? It took them 30 hours to get back up and running. And they were just going to chalk it off as a ghost on the machine, had no idea. And they asked us to do the incident response. We had the Clarity box up there and running. It had clocked everything that had happened. It showed, it laid it out, right? From the Profinet DCP stuff, just blowing their timers and shutting out. And the CVE basically said, if this happens to this make and model of PLC, it just resets its IP address back to 0, right? But they were just going to ignore that. I worked for a very large adult beverage manufacturer. One packaging line not putting liquid in a can or a bottle was 70 to 80 grand an hour of loss. There's no time machine to get into to get back and to make up for lost time. You're still paying salaries. You're still consuming resources. You still got trucks waiting in the yard or on the scales, right? You got raw material loss, all of these things that cost money. And everybody varies. Discrete manufacturers would say an hour downtime might be 50, 60 grand an hour. Automotive industries, $22,000, $23,000 a minute. So, if you're using OEE as a measuring stick, to determine how well you're performing, how much do you think that you're losing just by activities that happen in the environment that you don't even see, that you're just pumping money into a black hole in the middle of your plant because you don't know what happened. You don't know why things quit working, and these tools are changing that, right? These tools are creating an equal playground for especially for OT. especially if IT's behavior is scanning your network, patch updates, group policy changes, things that they do in the environment that you don't see, this changes that entire dynamic. So you can change behavior and maybe get that stuff to stop. That's, the internal threats that go on outside looking for the external stuff that can come wandering into your plant also.
Yeah, Frank, if I could jump in, one more thing. I've mentioned that business risk side, something to keep in mind, especially when they're thinking about getting started. Talk to who's ever in charge of your insurance. Their rates have probably increased, if not doubled, the last 2 years. Everybody's getting 40%. The insurance companies are waking up because of the impact and the exposure that they have on this operational side, on this production side, right? So the math is changing, and they're not able to, from an executive standpoint, go, well, we've got our risk covered because we've transferred our risk to this insurance. Well, the insurance costs twice as much as it did. You get half as much as coverage, and you can be darn sure they're going to really be tough to get any claims back out of. So that's part of that environment changing as this threat and these impacts become very real. Insurance companies are going to feel it, and that's going to hit the bottom line.
Makes perfect sense. Barry, let's go back to you. So what are some of the approaches to securely deploy autonomous edge computing platforms?
Yeah, I think first, we need to recognize that a one-size-fits-all is not the answer. Although every project needs to, of course, prioritize uptime, reliability, security, scalability, I think every environment is going to have different needs and different demands that have to be weighed and discussed. I think that's where some of that OT, IT engagement has to come in, where you understand, the OT has to take ownership of it because it is, after all, their process and it is the business. But they need to work with IT to understand what are some of the best practices that they can leverage and the tools that they can leverage. I guess my advice, kind of echoing on what Frank had said early on, is first start out by understanding what your assets are. How do they tie into the business processes? What is the IP? What is the value creation that's coming out of that? And that you need to be protecting and aware of, right? Don't forget about the human factor. Dino touched on that. Not all threats are external. Many of them are internal, and oftentimes they're not intentional or malicious. It's just people just making mistakes and not knowing any better. Understand what your OT environment is today, but also understand where you're going in the future and how it's going to evolve. 20 years ago, people didn't have connectivity, right? A lot of the stuff was sort of, you had this sort of idea that everything was air gapped and I didn't have these threats. But now with this idea of digital transformation and trying to bring all the data together, now you can make use of that data and you can drive, more productivity, more efficiency. So be thinking about where you're going, and try to establish a backbone that will grow with you. Something that can scale out with you, and be able to give you the flexibility to adopt new technology in the future. There's a lot of trends that are going on today. People are looking at things like software-based PLCs. You have a lot of augmented reality, analytics, both at the edge and in the cloud. Try to give yourself some flexibility so you can continue to grow and not go through this whole exercise all over again, because it certainly can be time-consuming and expensive to evaluate technology. And I guess, the final thing I'll say is, and this has been hit on, by Jim and Dino, is leverage your partners. Not everybody has the expertise in-house. Even within the OT IT convergence, leverage your partners. A lot of your vendors and your integration firms will have that capability where they'll have done this before. They'll understand kind of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and they can help you everything from designing where you want to go, implementing it, and even managing it. Because again, as Dino said, it is a full-time job. If you want to do it right, and you got to make sure that you're keeping eyes on it. And as you get that visibility, you got to make sure that you are able to respond to that visibility and do something about it.
And you mentioned air gapping a few minutes ago. That's not a real effective protection these days, if it ever was. Yes.
No, I can't tell you how many times we've gone to a customer site and they tell us we're air gapped, and then I go to a computer on their network and I'm like, oh, you have your own Google. The reality is that one, it isn't reality. People are not air gapped. They may think they are, but two, because of the drive for digital transformation and all the power of taking all that data and turning that information into valuable insights, and you want to leverage across different locations, you have to be able to connect these sites and these locations. So don't be scared of that. Embrace it, but go into it with your eyes wide open, and also be agile, because you're going to learn some stuff, and you're going to have to learn and evolve and adapt as you grow and as the industry grows.
Makes perfect sense. And the good news is we have some good time here at the end to take some audience questions. So now our presenters will answer some of the additional questions we've gotten during the webcast. If you do have questions, please type those for our presenters into the Ask a Question box on your screen. We'll get to as many questions as time allows. Questions that we do not get to today will be posted online with the archive version of this webcast. Before we start with that, remember to download a certificate of completion and a copy of the presentation. Use the Event Resources tab on the left side of your screen. And let's go ahead and get started with our audience questions here. This seems like a good place to start. So getting companies to invest in cybersecurity obviously can be a challenge. How would you go about getting buy-in for ed security from the top levels of the organization? How do you get the C-suite and people like that to buy in?
Well, I'll start. That's sort of that third leg of this stool that we're talking about with the IT and the OT. And that third leg, when you start talking cybersecurity, and being a former CIO, being a former in charge of the CISO roles and the other technical roles, don't get overly technical, because they'll stop listening to you within 30 seconds, and that might be generous, right? They're going to look at you and go, how much does this cost? And that's about where it ends, right? So you have to speak in a different type of language, and you have to start talking about risk and what is that risk. And then, hey, we're at risk, as was mentioned earlier, we're shut down. What happens if we're shut down for a day? Is that $1 million a day risk? And then, well, what's the likelihood? So very similar to enterprise risk management approach. What's the scenario that can happen? What's that risk? What's the likelihood? And what's the impact? And that's the conversation that you have to drive through. I always say right now, you ask a CFO, how do they know whether or not they're doing any better than they were last year in cybersecurity? OT or IT aside, they're going to say, well, we spent 10% more. I increased the budget 10%. Are you doing any better? Are you covering your risk? That's kind of gone by the wayside. So it has to be a bit of a risk discussion to open up the conversation of what to be done next.
Well, and I would like to add too that, Gartner sent out a report, if you follow what Gartner has to say, that, 70 to 75% of the CEOs over the next few years are going to be held personally liable and accountable and responsible for any of these attacks that happen on their watch, right? So, the buck's going to stop with them when it starts hitting them personally. So they're going to start asking some tougher questions of the IT and OT organization, and maybe dig into it a little bit more to try to understand it. The insurance is going to help drive that. Legal is going to help drive that. And so are these regulatory groups that are coming. The federal government's paying attention, especially around critical infrastructure. So there's going to have to be ways to measure on how well you're doing, and you're going to have to demonstrate that you're doing something. Right? You can't keep deflecting and pointing to IT and say, hey, that's their responsibility. That's not my responsibility. That's going to end, and it's going to end quickly. It is based on what we're seeing and everything that we're hearing out there.
So we talked a little bit about interruptions earlier today. So we've got a great question on that. Can an OT security visibility audit be performed without process interruption?
Absolutely. Unquestionably. And it goes back to something that was mentioned earlier around assessments and pen testing, because that's all we ever knew, right? For the longest time. And those were always disruptive. And as soon as an assessment's done, it's invalid as soon as the team walks off site, right? A lot of organizations would shut down a lot of their critical systems during maintenance windows and such, and then allow that work to be done just so it wouldn't impact them, right? And so, and Frank can speak to this, as regards to tools like Clarity and the passive nature and how they get started to provide that visibility. But the question is, you can absolutely put these tools in without disrupting production, for sure. Done a few dozen of them just since this year. So, Frank, do you want to
talk a little bit about Clarity in regards to that?
Well, I would just add, I think Dino, you're exactly right. And I encourage everyone to, leverage the thought leadership from this group. There's a lot of good technology, a lot of expertise. We're here to serve, and we can leverage technology to give you better visibility for what your environment's like, where you have risk, and it doesn't, to Dino's point, doesn't have to impact productivity or downtime.
And Gary, if I could add, I think oftentimes just doing a bit of a passive assessment sometimes before you try to bite off too much can also just help you kind of level set and baseline where you are, and then think about, okay, what's your roadmap going to be? Because oftentimes I've seen people, they try to do too much and then they feel overwhelmed, or they feel like they're not really accomplishing things. And sometimes just starting out with, where am I doing something, and then measuring later on, you'll see some of that incremental growth. And then, that also goes back to the investment to your executive team and your board. That's another way to also show value, because look, we were able to do this, here's the result, now we're going to go do more. And so I think sometimes actually doing a passive approach and just starting out with the baseline helps you by not having interruptions, but also helps you think about where you want to be in the future.
That's a great point, Barry, because one of the things that we see is it's like a Pandora's box. This is a box that, if you think of that facility, that nobody's ever looked into before. And then we're trying to describe what kind of risks are in there. We'll take one of those boxes, open it up, and actually look inside. And you go, wait a minute, we've got 15 other boxes in our organization just like that. Are you telling me that's likely that's in 15 other boxes? Yeah, we are. And now you've got a basis for a real basis for that conversation. And you can do it without interrupting the organization, without interrupting the process or production. But it up to now, nobody's looked in those boxes. Really, how many devices do I have? What kind of vulnerabilities are on there? When's the last time they were patched? What are they talking to? No, we put them in a box and we set them on the side, and we put maybe if we're lucky, we put a firewall on the outside of it, and we go, I hope it's working. It's still producing, so it must be working, right? Open it up, take a peek in one of those boxes, and I think you're going to be surprised, and that's going to help support, moving it forward within an organization.
Well, I want to follow on one other thing too. For those of you out there that are very familiar with your control systems and how little to no patching you do, and say, why would I patch? I can't patch. It's too costly. It's too expensive. So you do nothing. When you can have visibility to the environment to see if there's any anomalous behavior in there or any behavior changes at all, right? I mean, these tools are continuously monitoring that environment, just like IT monitors their stuff 24/7, 365. It never stops. Same thing needs to happen on the plant floor. If you can do it in a passive nature, which you can, to be able to sit there and make sure that if you have an environment, you're not going to patch those PLCs because it's too costly, it's too expensive, it's too whatever, then why not look for ways to microsegment that network? Why not keep an eye on it until you can determine a way on how you can secure it, which there's endpoint solutions that are out there that are available, or at least look for the OT or IT scanning of the environment, or changes or access or online edits that are being done that nobody knows about to the PLCs. I mean, all these other activities that go mask, right? So just because you can't patch the control system doesn't mean that you just ignore it, right? There's no reason you have to do that anymore.
Terrific. That's all great advice. One question that I want to jump into here. I think the Colonial Pipeline, whether it was a watershed moment in the cybersecurity industry or not, it certainly got people's attention and shine more of a spotlight on cybersecurity. So in hindsight, using the technology and tools that you have, what do you think could have prevented a Colonial Pipeline type hack from happening, both from an IT and an OT perspective?
Well, I'll start, Dino, and Dino and I have talked about this a lot. And one of the things to remember, and there is an IT and an OT perspective, if you assume that you're going to be compromised at some time, right? Every cybersecurity guy says it's not if, it's when, right? And then those are separation. The reason why Colonial got all the attention that it did, it wasn't because they lost credit card numbers, that somebody's medical information was released, that customer records were exposed. None of that. It was because that pipeline shut down, and they had to shut the pipeline down. And that, the physical implications of not only did that company, how much were they losing per day by not running it, right? And then what were the secondary implications of that? And people running out of gas, we saw it on TV, running out. Who knows if, the medicine wasn't getting, a truck couldn't deliver medicine to the local store. I mean, these are some pretty big implications. All while that pipeline was shut down, and they had to shut it down because they didn't know what was going on. Their IT side was getting ransomware and getting locked up. And they say, well, what's going on your side? Their public announcement was, we had to shut it down because safety, out of the abundance of caution and for safety measures. They didn't know. They didn't know whether it was safe to keep running. Was my SCADA system going to lock up? Was some other device? And that could cause even more with explosions and add on. I mean, it goes crazy. So to us, that's where we really see that happening. Even if it didn't get in, even if they weren't attacked, they couldn't tell you they weren't attacked. And so it's important, whether it's protection or just visibility, of making sure whether you're attacked.
Well, and I also think this the vernacular between IT and OT, right? Everybody keeps saying it was IT. It came in through IT. It was attacking IT systems. What a lot of people fail to realize is that those OT systems use the same technologies that IT uses, Windows being one of them. HMIs run on Windows. Historians run on Windows. Engineering workstations run on Windows, right? It could be Cisco switches if it was Cisco network and it was being attacked, right? And so in that particular case, how do you differentiate between IT and OT when you're using the same stuff, right? And to Jim's point, when it happened, the OT guys, they had no way, they had no visibility in their environment. They'd actually turned down opportunities from companies like Frank's that were going out there and selling intrusion detection systems specifically for their environment. They chose not to go down that path, right? So when you turn yourself away and say, well, I don't know if I've got malware running down there because I can't see anything in my space, right? Even though IT can see it, and IT can't see what's going on down there. To Jim's point, I got to shut it down, and I'm going to end up paying ransomware because it's costing me more money to be down than it is to pay them the $5 million that they want to get back up and running. They were losing that probably in 15 minutes.
That definitely makes sense. Let's move on to the next one here. So what should I do so I can execute a proof of concept to test the feasibility of my cybersecurity edge computing solution right now and then be able to scale it later?
Well, going back to, framework, right? Number one, tenant visibility, right? And so with these tools, you can get visibility right out of the gate. Initially when these OT platforms were hitting the market, a lot of organizations were just using them for asset inventory, just to kind of get an idea of what their assets were that they had out there. What do I have in Pandora's box? Let me see it, see what's connected. That's the first thing that you want to do is you want to get a visibility program going just to see what assets that you have out there. To points that have been made a few times, when we go in there, it's never what the client expects, right? The myth factor comes in. You got plants communicating with plants across control systems. You have access to the internet. You have IT assets that are talking to PLCs or the OT assets. You want to know that stuff, right? And waiting on other IT programs to get in place, whether it be MDR, network upgrades, whatever they might be doing, it's taking budget resources to do their thing and ignoring OT, it needs to end, right? You need to start carving out your own budget and get a visibility program in place to find out what you're up against. That's job one, identification. Then you can start the whole detect, protect, respond, recover, as you go through the maturity model in deploying these types of systems and organizing behind it and managing it.
Yeah, and just to call out on that, there's a number of different frameworks out there for cybersecurity and protection. It doesn't matter which one that you pick. The first step is identify, right? And the first step is identify. You can't protect what you can't see. The way you can't manage risks that you don't know about. So no matter what framework that you want to throw the alphabet and the number at, every framework starts with identify and then works from there. So if they're looking for a starting point, it's identify.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, is to be thinking about, as part of your selection process, be thinking about what are the different criteria and considerations that you want to consider. Because I agree with what Dino and Jim are saying, and having that visibility, identifying, but also as you're evaluating, in your RFPs, what are the different criteria that you want to include, so that you can actually have your vendors tell you what they do, so that you're considering that as you're putting new devices. Because again, going back to what I said earlier on, oftentimes people struggle with, how do I make sure that something new is going to create more of a bad situation for me? So think about those requirements, incorporate them into your RFP, incorporate them into your POC testing, so that you can ensure that you have, a bit more of an understanding of what's going in before you go and deploy it.
Yeah, and the other thing I had real quick is, do tabletop exercises with all the players, right? Get your IT and OT people and the risk people in the same room. And if you got partners that need to be there, bring them in and do a tabletop exercise and walk through this, and that'll help also, you prior to the visibility study, or after you get the visibility study and you get this data back, maybe then you sit down and do a tabletop exercise or workshop. Yeah. Those are all beneficial.
Those are all great comments. I'll just add, it kind of feels like a public service announcement, quite frankly. Don't wait until you're sick to go to the doctor. Go do your annual exam. I can't tell you, I think somebody said it, can't recall a time when an assessment was done and the client said, that's exactly what I expected. So, look, take that step. You've got vendors here, Clarity here. We're all willing to help. Reach out, and we'll do our very best to give you a better assessment for what your situation is and where, if and where you might be exposed.
Terrific. So we only have a few minutes left, sadly. So I'm going to ask one last question here for a quick answer. More attackers seem to be targeting OT and ICS systems. Why is that happening? Again, please, a quick answer on this one.
Because they pay. They pay. It's the cash register getting shut down, and they're using the Colonial Pipeline, $4 or $5 million ransomware. What were they losing in a day being shut down? That's, I don't know if anyone else has something to add to that, but it's because they pay.
That's probably the concise answer for that. Yeah, it's profitable, and that's what people are looking for right now. So
I win with the brevity answer of the day, right?
Look, I always ask for a short answer at the end of these, and I'm amazed when I get one. So kudos to all four of you for that. But I just want to say thank you again for all the great questions to everybody out there who's watching. Thanks again to our speakers for sharing your time and expertise.
Thank you.
And now that we are just about done, the last thing is we want to hear how we did. So an exit survey is going to pop up on your screen as soon as this webcast ends. Please take a moment to complete it, because we use this information to improve our future webcasts. Finally, on behalf of Control Engineering, Industrial Cybersecurity Pulse, and Stratus, I'd like to thank you for attending. This concludes our webcast. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.